Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. We're gonna have some fun here in today's video, but I want to kind of frame this video up first and foremost because I put some comments out on Twitter this past week, and I re-emphasized those comments in an interview with Yahoo Finance, where I suggested that there was a possibility that the next move higher for Canadian housing prices could be a face-ripping rally higher. Okay, those are my words. Now, before you get all upset and bombard me here in the comments, I just want you to hear me out. I want to focus for a moment and frame this video up on what is happening in the Canadian finance and monetary policy aspect, which is basically frames my view and thesis for these comments, okay? So, if you haven't been following the space, obviously since COVID, we've had massive fiscal spending. Basically, it seems like there's this unlimited money printer where the government will pay everybody a $2,000 a month check if you're a small or medium-sized business, and we're going to shut you down, but we're going to hand you some more money. And and the Bank of Canada is essentially helping to basically finance this government spending. Now, some people are alluding to it. It sounds like MMT, modern monetary theory. If you haven't read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kilton, I highly encourage you to check that out. But this basically argues that governments do not have a restraint on fiscal spending. It essentially argues that as long as you are a sovereign, a government, as long as you are printing currency, your own sovereign, that you can essentially print your own currency and spend as much money you want from the government perspective. And there are basically no repercussions other than inflation, and the idea is that essentially you can just tax inflation away when or if it eventually comes. And so in the political space now, this is becoming a very contentious point. The point being that the government just seems to want to spend into oblivion, and the central bank, the Bank of Canada, is essentially helping them, or they're basically subsidizing the government to allow them to do this through quantitative easing, QE, aka money printing. And so let's quickly scroll in to the comments here from Pierre Poilievre in the Member of Parliament's video here.
Carlton.
With our unemployment the highest in the G7, the 1.8 million Canadians without jobs are wondering what the economic plan is. Well, yesterday we learned that the finance minister's plan is debt-fueled government spending. The Bank of Canada's governor's plan is debt-fueled consumer spending. It's the credit card strategy. How to pay it all back? Well, we'll cross that bridge when it collapses. Mr. Speaker, when will this government realize Canadians want paychecks, not bigger credit card bills?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me start where the member opposite started, which is something that is so important to this government: jobs for Canadians. And let me just point out to everyone in this House that the job recovery in Canada has been stronger than in the United States. TD pointed this out in a report they issued on October 20th. This is what they said: no matter how you slice the data, the Canadian labour market has been on a steadier road to recovery relative to the US. This is true both for full-time and part-time employment, despite similar depths of initial decline. Mr. Speaker, we're working hard for Canadians and Canadian jobs.
The Honourable Member for Carlton.
Well, she quotes bankers because bankers are thrilled with all the printed money that's being pumped into their profit margins. But she forgets to mention that we still have the highest unemployment in the G7, higher than the United States, in fact. And what do we have in response? So far, no budget in a record 18 months. We have no number to associate with the deficit, no spending levels to report, no date for the fall economic update. And the last time we had those biweekly reports on COVID spending, well, that was back before Bill Morneau became Bill No More. Mr. Speaker, when are we going to get some facts about the recovery?
Of course, what Pierre is referring to is the fact that the Bank of Canada's balance sheet since the pandemic, they now own 35% of the Canadian government bond market. 35%. So QE, they own 35% of the Canadian bond market. They're basically helping to subsidize this fiscal spending. At the current pace, which has now been revised slightly, by this time next year, the Bank of Canada will own 50% of the Canadian bond market. Now again, if you're sitting here wondering why everything for example, why is housing going up during a pandemic? Shouldn't the banks be scared to lend money? Shouldn't they be clamping down on credit? Well, again, part of this, a huge reason of this is basically because of the Bank of Canada helping to essentially provide the liquidity to the banks to continue lending. And again, I would argue they probably didn't have a choice, but now that they own 35% of the bond market and climbing, people are starting to ask, is there a limit? And we're going down this slippery slope, obviously, of like, are we engaging in modern monetary theory? Is it already here? Now again, the mechanics aren't slightly MMT, but it's almost like its own version of MMT where it can slowly start to morph into that, and then that CERB morphs into universal basic income. But ironically, the Bank of Canada was asked this past week about Pierre's comments and about the growing comments in the political space about what the Bank of Canada is up to. All of a sudden, people are starting to figure out what a central bank's primary role is and what they're doing behind the scenes. Remember, these guys, 98% of Canadians probably don't even know what a central bank is or who Tiff Macklem is, for that matter. But make no mistake, this guy has an enormous impact on your day-to-day lives. And so a reporter actually asked him what his thoughts were in terms what his response was to Pierre's comments. So let's clip to that.
I wanted to ask about news this month where Conservative lawmaker Pierre Poilievre cautioned the central bank against financing Justin Trudeau's spending plans beyond the immediate pandemic emergency measures because of any political implications. I wanted to know what your thoughts are on this.
We've been very clear from the start, as we've taken these exceptional measures, that they are focused on achieving our inflation target. And today, we've as we just discussed, we've reinforced our forward guidance, indicating that in our current projection, we don't expect slack to be absorbed until sometime in 2023. We've recalibrated our quantitative easing to increase its impact while reducing the overall amount of purchases. Those actions were taken to provide the stimulus that we think is needed to get inflation back to target. That is what's guiding us.
Let's break Tiff's comments down, because the Bank of Canada, again, had this press release last week. They did this long interview, which I sat there and enjoyed the 45-minute press conference that it was. Basically, what the Bank of Canada is inclined to do. So now, because of this political pushback, the Bank of Canada was purchasing $5 billion per week of bonds. $5 billion per week. They were committed to $5 billion per week. They scaled that back now. So okay, we're going to reduce it. We'll reduce it to $4 billion now per week. So we'll reduce it to $4 billion. But what they did is they, instead of buying the front end of the yield curve, so shorter duration bonds, they're now buying longer durations. So Tiff was saying five-year bonds, 10-year bonds, that sort of duration. And his argument for that was, well, we're going to help households and businesses because that's primarily what they're borrowing at. For example, the primary instrument that Canadian households will borrow is a 5-year mortgage or 5-year mortgage rate. So why don't we start buying the 5-year bonds, and that will basically keep rates from going up, and it'll actually probably push them down. So what he's basically doing is he's flattening out this yield curve. He's also said that based on their inflation projections, that they will not raise interest rates until 2023. Okay? He literally said, unless inflation is sustainably met, we don't see inflation sustainably hitting our goal until 2023. Okay, so basically the logistic that you need to know here is the Bank of Canada is explicitly coming out and telling you, we're not going to stop QE, we're going to reduce it to $4 billion, we're going to buy more of the longer end curve to keep mortgage rates suppressed. We're going to keep interest rates pinned to basically zero where they're at right now until at least 2023. And we're going to keep this going because we cannot tolerate deflation. Now, again, these guys have a moving target in terms of inflation. I mean, based on the Bank of Canada's own projections, they've actually failed to meet their target over the past decade. So they've actually failed to meet their 2% target over the past 10 years, if you actually average it out. Now, can anybody sit here honestly and tell me that inflation is actually, over the last 10 years, inflation has been below 2%? Again, that's what the official CPI metric will tell you, but realistically, everybody knows that asset prices and rents, for example, and groceries have been going up, basically close to double digits. So there is no doubt the real inflation rate is, for most people, arguably significantly higher than what they've been reporting. So again, now I want to circle this all back and say, okay, we know now what the argument is. The argument is basically we're going down this seemingly unlimited fiscal spending, where Krista Freeland says, oh, it's not MMT, but yet the Bank of Canada is essentially doing this. They're going to own 50% of the bond market, a couple of years to keep up this pace. You cannot exit quantitative easing. Once you start QE, you cannot exit QE. So at some point, the Bank of Canada will probably own, similar to the Bank of Japan, they'll probably own basically the entire bond market, where basically the bonds don't actually trade. So my thesis on the Canadian housing was, okay, so if we're going to have 5-year fixed, we're in the midst of a pandemic, recession. You could argue depression. It will at the end of the year, the numbers will come in. It'll be the worst recession we've seen since the early 1900s. Okay, so from a statistical measure, anyways, it's really bad. Now, the fact that house prices have actually been rising during this period should really tell you that something isn't quite right. And the reality is that the central bankers and the governments don't actually have an option. You can't just put your hands up and let it ride. So what they've done is they've decided to kick the can further down the road. So if you're determined to keep mortgage rates basically at sub 2% for the indefinite future, you're determined to keep interest rates, as Tiff said, until at least 2023. And again, by next conference, I'll probably be telling you it's 2024. So this number keeps pushing further and further out. So you're going to keep rates at zero. And, eventually, when things start to return to more of this normal and this pandemic goes away, you're going to bring back immigration. In fact, today, the Trudeau government came out and said, we are ramping up our immigration targets for 2021 and 2022. We're talking huge numbers. Now, again, I don't know if they're actually going to hit those numbers when there's no jobs, but you can see what they're trying to do. So when real estate prices are rising right now during a recession and during a period of low immigration, I am a little bit concerned that should immigration begin to ramp up, should jobs slowly begin to come back, should the economy get a little bit better, should consumer confidence get a little bit stronger, and then if you're determined to keep rates where they're at, you run the risk of another runaway in house prices. And that's basically what we're seeing right now in the single family housing market, is rampant inflation in that asset class. So that's that was my thesis for that face ripping rally higher. And it's not, so I have to laugh because I was getting all this pushback. It's like, don't shoot the messenger. I didn't create the system. I'm just sitting here and saying, okay, well, what do I do with my money? So I am only saying this because you need to make your own decisions. So for me personally, my personal view is I'm going to lever long on these guys. If you're Tiff Macklem and you're telling me to borrow your brains out, as he did right here.
Given that the savings rate has skyrocketed, I wonder if I can read between the lines of what you said, that you're telling households, listen, don't worry about interest rates going up. If you need to borrow to buy a capital asset, a car, a TV, borrow to make the bills, it's okay. The bank has got your back for the medium term, at least, to keep rates low. Am I sort of right in interpreting that you're giving households the green light to maybe borrow a bit to get through this?
What we're saying is that we're going to get through this, but it's going to be a long slog. And we're telling Canadians, and our forward guidance has been very clear, that we're going to hold our policy interest rate at the effective lower bound until slack is absorbed, so that we can sustainably achieve our 2% inflation target. And we've indicated that's not going to happen into sometime into 2023. So what does that mean? Yes, it means that, if you're a household considering making a major purchase, if you're a business considering investing, you can be confident that interest rates will be low for a long time.
If Tiff Macklem's going to tell me to borrow my brains out, I am going to borrow my brains out. And again, if you want to destroy the currency and, destroy part of society because of that, there's nothing I can do about it. But I'll play along. I'll play along with that game. So this is the dilemma right now. And this is the thesis of the whole video is really just behind educating Canadians in terms of what policymakers are doing, because most people don't pay attention to this stuff. Most people are going to sit down and watch a 45-minute interview of what the central banker is going to tell us or what they're going to do. So again, this is kind of where I see things going for this potential face-ripping rally higher. I certainly hope that isn't the case. Now, the biggest feedback that I got on that tweet was people were arguing that inflation was going to pick up and that the central banks would raise interest rates. And all of a sudden, mortgage rates are going to go from 1.8% to 2.5% to 3.5% to 6%, and everything's going to blow up. And I said, okay, that's fine. I don't disagree. There's always a possibility. But it's like, if you actually think the central bank and the governments are actually going to do the right thing, which is like, oh, we should raise interest rates, you don't realize that they physically, literally cannot raise interest rates. You can't. Like, it's like once you start quantitative easing, once you put rates to zero, and once you build up this massive debt pile, you can't raise interest rates. Okay, so people are like, well, yeah, the households are going to blow up because rates are going to go up eventually. And I said the same thing. It was like, okay, well, you won't have a job either, because go look at Canadian, go look at the corporate debt in Canada. It's equally as massive as the portion of debt on households. What do you see? All these corporations then go bankrupt. So then nobody has a job. Everybody loses their house because mortgage rates go up, and the cost of the Canadian government to service their debt blows through the roof, and the Canadian government's insolvent. So literally the entire system is insolvent. So that's why I'm saying is that you can't raise interest rates. So these guys will do whatever that needs to be done to keep the system going, to keep the game going. So that could be a debt jubilee. That could be, for example, okay, rates start to creep up. Okay, amortizations go from 30 years to 40 years. That could be a whole host of things. They just literally change and write the rules, or they just buy up all the debt, or there becomes this universal basic income. There's all these programs that they're going to have to design, because there cannot be a way to, and this is not just a Canadian thing, this is globally. In fact, amongst the 10 largest countries, here's the effective policy rate for central banks It's basically at zero globally. So this entire system has been built on that. So again, I don't know what the exit is. I don't know how this system goes, eventually resets and figures itself out. But if you want to like entertain that thought and that idea, there's actually a really good podcast by Grant Williams. It's called The End Game. So Grant Williams is the co-founder of Real Vision. He does a podcast called The End Game. I highly encourage you to check it out. But basically, he interviews all these smart hedge fund money manager guys, really brilliant thinkers, and they kind of just sit there and pontificate about like how the system, like how does this eventually end? Like obviously, like it just can't go on forever. Like again, is it going to be like the debt jubilee? Is it going to be like an entire reset? Does it turn into a Great Depression? Like, how does that work? I don't know, but it's fun to sit here and pontificate because the reasons why I have to laugh, because I had this conversation with a client, sophisticated client, a money manager, and we said, so he's going long housing. So he's like, I've been bearish, I've been renting, I have the capital. I'm not renting because I don't have money. Like, he's a well-off guy. And he goes, I'm going long housing because I think there's going to be like a currency crisis. This is they're basically telling me that they're going to inflate away. They're explicitly telling us that they're devaluing the currency at an unprecedented pace. That's what they're telling me. So I'm going to go long a bunch of debt and just let them inflate it away. That was his rationale for purchasing. And I had to laugh because I said to him, do you realize that you are competing, for example, you're competing on a property. Do you realize the people that you're competing with for these single family houses where they're all going multiple offers? I said the people that are buying these houses literally have no idea that like this is like a real possibility. Like most people, 99% of them are literally just buying because like they want a house to live in, and they have no idea like that the system is broken, that the monetary system is probably going to blow up, that they're explicitly devaluing the currency, that nobody actually knows who Tiff Macklem is when they're buying a house. They just want a house. So it's just funny because like you have two trains of thought. It's like you can be bullish for different reasons. Most people are just bullish because they just think Vancouver real estate can never go down because it's like a nice city. What they don't realize is like, well, no, it hasn't gone down because there's just been like massive manipulation from all angles of the market. But that's okay. You can play along with that. So that was kind of my thesis behind this whole video. Just understanding that, like, again, behind me, bullish or bearish, like you can be bullish because you're bearish on the system, and that's kind of where I'm personally leading to as well these days, after explicitly watching what these guys have done during an economic crisis, knowing that this is setting a precedent for future economic crises. And so those are my thoughts for this week. Love to hear your comments below. I know it was a longer one. We'll see you next week.